Okay, today I'm going to go through configuring the Repetier host software to work with the RPM and configuring Slicer to work with RPM. The first thing I'm going to do is launch the Repetier host. And this should be the latest version of the software for Windows. If you are running on a Mac, I will try to do a similar thing for the Mac, but you should know that the Repetier host is typically several versions behind on the Macintosh. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you come in is scroll over to the top right side and click on Printer Settings. Now, if you don't have your RPM plugged in, you're going to want to plug it in right away and tap on Refresh Ports. And what this will do is discover the repeater, the RPM, if it wasn't plugged in when you started a repeater. Now, the first time that you plug the RPM in, Windows should go out and automatically download and install the appropriate FTDI driver for it, so you should be good to go. I know on my system, it's on COM port 3. The default speed for it is 250,000, and transfer protocol you can say auto detect. Now, what you may want to do is come up here where it says default and click and type in RPM 3D printer. Now, the reason I'm doing RPM 3D printer is if you have the milling package, you're going to define it slightly differently. So, the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure that I can talk to the machine before I finish the configuration in here. So I'm just going to come down here and click OK. And now I'm going to come to the upper left and click on Connect. And you can see down at the bottom of the screen that it is indeed connecting to the RPM printer. Now what you're going to want to do, let's just make sure that that things can move. So I'm coming over here to the right underneath where it said Printer Settings, and I'm clicking on the Manual Control tab. Now, if you look at your RPM, if you're sitting at the front of it, in other words, the power supply and everything is away from you, the upper left corner, so the corner closest to you and to the left, is considered 0, 0. And if the z-axis is at the bottom, that would be the origin, 0, 0, 0. So you're going to want to look at where the head is in relationship to the origin. So if it's at the origin, what you're going to want to do is make positive moves to test things. If it is far enough away from the origin, you can make positive or negative moves in any axis. Right now, mine's pretty much in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click right here on the x-axis. And if you notice, as I move my mouse, if I go in closer towards the center, it says 0.1 millimeter. So that'll do 0.1 millimeter move. Slightly farther to the right, there's 1 millimeter, 10 millimeters, and 100 or 50 millimeters. So I'm just going to move it 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter. This should move it basically in the orientation that you see the arrows. So this should move it 1 centimeter to the right. And I clicked on it, and sure enough, it moved 1 centimeter to the right. So that's good. What I'm going to do next, before I finish setting everything up, I'm going to go in and load a configuration file that I received from the folks down at Quintessential Universal Building Device to configure Slicer. So I came up here and I clicked on the Slicer tab on the right hand side, and I'm going to come down and click on Configure. Make sure that the slicer says Slicer, and then click on the Configure button. And what that's going to do is it's going to launch the version of Slicer that shipped with, that was installed with a Repetier host. So it should bring up a window here that will allow me to configure Slicer. And here we are. Now you can see that I've got some other configs in here. I actually run multiple 3D printers. So right now I've got configs in here for an ORD printer, and I don't have my one up in here, so it's just the ORD. What I'm going to do is I have the file from Cubed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load that configuration file, and I have this file posted out on the internet so anyone can get it. I just go to File, Load Config, and I saved this config file out on my desktop. So I'm just going to come down here and RPM config. I'll just double click on that and it's going to load it in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as RPM config space PLA because this is set up with the default temperatures and everything for printing PLA plastic. So you can see it's got the initial layer height 0.2 millimeters, first layer is 0.3 millimeters. You can adjust these to your desires, you know, as far as how you want it to work. Some of the important things, you know, infill isn't really that important. You can set it up. This is set for a 10% infill. If you have multiple extruders, you're going to want to come in here and tell it you have multiple extruders and how to use them. Skirt and brim, typically you want to do a couple of loops with a skirt around the object. What this does is it primes the extruder to make sure that the plastic is heated up and flowing. So that's good. Speed. These are the speeds that are recommended for doing printing. These are pretty much the standard slicer speeds. As far as filament settings go, the RPM uses 1.75 millimeter filament, extrusion multiplier of 1, and for PLA a good temperature is 195 degrees. Now with PLA you really don't want to use the heated print bed. If your room's above 60 degrees, PLA actually sticks pretty good to the print bed that's in there. If you're below 60 degrees or you're more of a traditionalist, you can just put down some blue painter's tape. A lot of people really like using the blue painter's tape. It makes things stick very well. The settings for cooling, you can see what they are. I mean, it's really not doing any auto cooling or anything with PLA. Now, the important settings are here are the dimensions that we have for the RPM. So basically it's saying X is 290, Y is 250, and then it's saying, you know, half of those distances to place the piece in the center. And what this will do is when you slice an object, it'll move to the center of the print bed before slicing them. Well, before printing them, pardon me. Custom G-code. Really all you're doing here with this custom G-code is this is setting the origin to wherever the print head is when you start the print. One of the things to note about the RPM is there are no limit switches on it. So all of the homing on it is manual. So really what this is doing is just saying wherever the print head is when you start, that is the origin. So I'm going to use that as 000 and move from there. So it's very important that before you start a print job, you go and manually home the print head. So you want to move it to that forward left position, so closest to you to the left, and get the print head right down on the print plate. You pretty much want to have the width of one piece of paper between the print head and the print bed. So you can just get it down close, then you start doing the negative 0.1 millimeter steps until you start feeling a little bit of tension on a piece of paper that's just sliding underneath it. Settings for the extruder, these are important. The nozzle is 0.4 millimeters. What else do we have in here? Extra length. Okay, so this is all pretty standard setup. Layer retracting, minimum raffle, length on restart. Okay, retraction length. That's what I was looking for, 0.5 millimeters. So what that does is anytime the print head needs to move without printing, it retracts the plastic a 0.5 millimeter. Now, if you're printing things that are very detailed and there's a lot of traveling around of the head when it's not printing, you may want to set this to 1 millimeter. That'll help you prevent getting some of those fine hairs on things. So the main thing that I wanted to remember out of here is the 290 and 250. So in each of these tabs, print settings, you can really say, you don't have to save this as config PLA. You could just save it as RPM config. The only thing that's specific to PLA is the filament settings. So this is where you really want to save it as RPM config space PLA. I don't know. I've always just gotten into the habit on each of the tabs to save it with the same name. That's my own little bit of finickiness. It really doesn't matter. Like I said, the only tab that's really relevant to being PLA specific is the filament tab. So once you have this set up, you can close out of here, and you have you've got things configured for Slicer. Now I'm going to disconnect from the printer because I can't modify the printer while I'm connected. And I'm going to come back over here to printer settings. Printer, these are all pretty standard settings. There's nothing you need to change here. But printer shape. You're going to say that this is a classic printer. X-min is 0. And we had 290 from Slicer and 250 for Y. And this is once again over here saying front and left is 0, 0. We can come back here and change the width and depth to correspond. And I have found on my RPM by moving the axes around that this is also, I'm just going to use 250 for the height of the print area. And you can say OK. Now you've got repeater fully configured to use with the RPM, and you have Slicer set for PLA. Now in the Slicer settings, let's go back in and configure the Slicer settings one more time. If you like printing with ABS, basically different plastics like to print at different temperatures. So I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to click on the filament tab. And for ABS, I usually print around 230 degrees. And with ABS, you're not going to use the blue painter's tape or anything. Instead, you're going to heat the print bed. This helps the ABS stick, and it prevents it from warping. I like to use, it starts sticking around 65 degrees or so, so I set my print bed to 75 degrees. And then what you can do is save this, really only on the filament tab again, as ABS. Oops, hit caps lock. And now you've got a setting that you can use for printing ABS. So all you need to do is you can come into repeater, you can load up a file. That's an STL file. I can come over here to Slicer, and what I need to do here is select the configs I want. This PLA, RPM printer, RPM printer, RPM printer. Now it's all set to print with PLA. I can click on Slice. And there we go, it's created all the G-code. Now I can click on print and the job would run. So that's really all there is to this. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to document is if you come into here to config. Oops, I need to reconnect again. If you come to config and go to, come on, config and go to firmware EEPROM settings. These EEPROM settings come in here by default from Qubed. So these are really what you need for printing. And you can see you've got 295, 220, 268. So you can use those as well. What I'm looking for in here is acceleration. Okay, and what you're going to want to do in here, the reason I'm looking at this is you're going to want to document what these acceleration settings are. So for X it's 100, Y it's 100, and Z it's 75. The reason you're going to want to document those is because when you configure this to run as a CNC mill, you're going to change those values. And I will do a separate video to show you how to configure this as a CNC mill. So hopefully that gets you what you need for Repeater Host to get things up and printing.